I'd like to thank everybody for logging on here tonight. I'm John Foster. I'm a librarian in the Adult Information Services Department at Mentor Public Library. Those of you who are habitués of the library, at times when you can actually come into the building, and hopefully that will be soon again. We'll see me often at the reference desk or giving talks about history or what have you. We're here tonight with Todd Arrington, who many of you will know from his many very engaging talks on the subject of the Civil War and our leaders and legacies of the Civil War ongoing program. Todd has, as everyone here is certainly well aware, recently written a book, The Last Lincoln Republican. I had to return, I would normally at this moment hold up a copy of the book, but I had to return my copy of it because somebody had it on hold. There it is. That's on University of Kansas Press?
Yeah, University Press of Kansas. Yes.
University Press of Kansas. Hopefully we're going to get some more copies of it. It's a fantastically engaging book, really, really well written and a lot of information, but doesn't, you know, Todd and I were talking earlier before the recording started about how there's a kind of a midpoint to hit with historical books between, you know, piling in so many facts that it just blows the reader away and, you know, being sort of less substantial. So this is what we're going to do for tonight. Todd gave a talk about this about a month ago in what seems like a time before time now. But what I thought we would do is just have a little sort of interview segment where I ask Todd a few questions, not anything that is likely to catch him out, but, you know, just some points of interest. Maybe he can get to some things that he didn't get to in the talk. Also, if people are interested in asking questions, actually, that's why we decided to do this with a live audience, so to speak. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will put them to Todd. Other than that, I think we are ready to go. So the election of 1880 was one of the more interesting ones, certainly in the history of the 19th century, in the history of the country, I think, arguably. What I read, and I can't remember whether I read it in. I think it was mentioned in your book, but it was also mentioned somewhere else that it was one of the highest voter turnout elections in the history of the country, and I think to this day, proportionally, that's still true.
Yeah, it was very high. It was somewhere around 80%, I think, something in that neighborhood, which is obviously very high. So it was a very high voter turnout. And then, of course, it was also, in terms of popular vote victory, it was also, I believe, still the narrowest popular vote victory. Garfield did, in fact, win the popular vote very narrowly, less than 10,000 votes out of, you know, however many millions were cast. Now, of course, as everyone knows, and if you're paying attention to the news at all, even today, you know this, that, you know, the popular vote doesn't elect the president, the Electoral College does. So Garfield's margin in the Electoral College was substantial. So it was definitely decisive in the Electoral College. But yeah, the popular vote was very narrow, and the voter turnout was very high, 80 or maybe even a little higher percent.
The preceding president, Rutherford B Hayes, had announced at the beginning of his term that he was going to be a one-term president. This seems like a very odd thing to do because it means that you're going to be a 3-year president, because normally the president in his 4th year is trying to convince people to give him 4 more years. Of course, Hayes was not doing that. Why was it that he made that promise?
Well, you know, it was not that uncommon for 19th century presidents to only serve one term. There were a number of presidents who voluntarily just served one term. James K. Polk famously, Franklin Pierce, you know, had no interest in running for a second term. So it was not unheard of. You know, Hayes, I think, knew that his presidency, first of all, he knew his path to victory was very narrow. I don't think he anticipated just how narrow it actually would end up being with this whole disputed election that took place in 1876. But I think he viewed himself as kind of a, you know, somebody who could get into the office and would do no damage and would kind of be a caretaker of the country for 4 years, and then would be able to finish his time and come back to I should say to Ohio, because he was from Ohio. I think he also felt like he could be more effective as a president if he knew he only had this 4 years. So he could really put everything he had into those 4 years. He would avoid exactly what you just mentioned, John, which was this idea that you know, he's spending the last year of his term basically running for re-election. So I think he felt like he could be far more effective if he committed himself to just being a one-term president. And so, yeah, he stated, and this was long before all of the dispute about, who was going to win the three southern states, South Carolina, Louisiana, Florida, that ended up being disputed in that election. Actually, in his letter of acceptance of the Republican nomination in 1876, he said he would only serve one term. So the Republicans went into the election of 1876 knowing, even if we win, we're going to have to find somebody else in 1880. In 1876, I don't think really anybody thought that person would end up being James Garfield, but they certainly knew, the Republicans, even as early as prior to the 1876 election, that they were going to need a candidate in 1880.
So yeah, the election of 1876 was hotly contested, and I was explaining some of the things that went on to my historian wife as she passed by me reading the book, and I was like, yeah, there was sort of a second Louisiana Purchase, allegedly at least of many votes. Talk a little bit about how the election of 1876 shook out, and how that influenced the election of 1880.
Sure. So, well, of course, one of those things is what I just mentioned, is that obviously everyone knew that 4 years down the road, the Republicans were going to have to look for another candidate, because even if Hayes won, he wasn't going to run again. But this 1876 election, and that's really where I start the book, is kind of laying the groundwork for 1880, sort of exactly like the question you're asking. So I appreciate the question. The 1876 election, this was still Reconstruction. Now, there were, most Southern states had been what Southern Democrats called redeemed, meaning that they had kind of taken power back from Republicans who they considered to be what they called carpetbaggers, meaning, primarily Republicans who came from down to the South from the North to run these Southern states during radical Republican Reconstruction, when Congress was really calling the shots on how the Southern states would be run. So white Southern Democrats had started to retake power in a lot of these Southern states. So they had managed to win governorships, to take over state legislatures. And there were only 3 Southern states that were still what they called unredeemed, meaning they were still being run by Republicans. And those states were South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. So pretty much every other state in the South, most people assumed would go for Samuel Tilden, who was the Democratic presidential candidate in 1880. Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida were kind of up in the air, because even though white Southern Democrats were the bulk of the voters, there was also, obviously in those states, in all of those Southern states, a very heavy contingent of African American voters. And at this point in American history, African Americans are overwhelmingly Republican, because, of course, the Republicans are the party of Lincoln and the party of abolition and emancipation. So in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, there's this strong sense that the African American vote could potentially carry those states for the Republicans. In a lot of the other Southern states where white Southern Democrats had kind of taken power back from Republicans, everybody kind of expected there to be a lot of voter suppression there by white Democrats against African American Republicans. And so sure enough, when election day came, the South was solid for the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden, but there was this massive dispute about which slate of electors, the Republican or the Democratic electors, should be seated and recognized from South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. So ultimately, it came down to those 3 states. Whoever won those 3 states would have the necessary votes to win the Electoral College and then would become president. And so, both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, sent people to those 3 Southern states, including James Garfield, who was actually asked by President Ulysses S. Grant to go to Louisiana and be kind of an election observer, kind of in the modern parlance, if you will, kind of some of the things we're still hearing about in the news today of observers going and watching recounts and things like this. This was all happening in 1876. This is not, new to 2020. And so the dispute was which set of electors are going to be recognized and are going to be able to cast their ballots for the president for their candidate when it came time for the Electoral College to vote. And of course, everybody knows how it all shook out because nobody's ever heard of President Samuel J. Tilden, even though Tilden won the popular vote. No question, he won the popular vote and was leading in the Electoral College. Neither he nor Hayes had enough votes to win the Electoral College. And when this all shook out, and it took months for this all to shake out, eventually, of course, Rutherford B Hayes became the 19th president of the United States. So he goes into office in March of 1877, and already the Republicans are thinking about 1880 because, again, they know Hayes is only going to be a one-term president. So now he comes into office with this kind of black cloud hanging over him, with a lot of people thinking that the election was a fraud, it was stolen, and then also on top of that, everybody knows he's only going to be there for those 4 years. So it was a very interesting time in American history. Not the first disputed election we've had, and obviously not the last, but certainly one of the most consequential in my view.
Yeah, I mean, a very interesting, and this is, I think, one of the things that's interesting about this book is that it has a kind of relevance to the current moment, in the sense that it's a time when the country is very polarized, when there's not a lot of imputing sympathetic values to the other side going on, especially because of the Civil War. There's the whole issue that you talk about, what was referred to at the time as waving the bloody shirt. That is to say, invoking the Civil War as a way of mobilizing people against the Democrats and against people from the South. And into this comes James Garfield, a person that you're obviously well familiar with in your professional life as a ranger at the Garfield Memorial site, which, as everyone here must know, is right next door to where I work as well. But I really feel like Garfield is one of the sort of less known and less understood presidents, to a great extent because he's assassinated relatively early in his term. So I want to read this line, and I think that this gets to something that's important about Garfield. This is from a famous speech that Oliver Wendell Holmes gave on Memorial Day in 1884. Oliver Wendell Holmes, later Associate Justice of the Supreme Court from 1902 to 1930, and then acting Chief Justice for 2 years after that. But he gave this speech. He had served in the Civil War, and he said the following: "But nevertheless, the generation that carried on the war has been set apart by its experience. Through our great good fortune, in our youth, our hearts were touched with fire. It was given to us to learn at the outset that life is a profound and passionate thing. While we are permitted to scorn nothing but indifference, and do not pretend to undervalue the worldly rewards of ambition, we have seen with our own eyes, beyond and above the gold field, the snowy heights of honor, and it is for us to bear the report to those who come after us." And so this, I think, speaks to a great extent to the feelings that the men who had served in the Civil War, who had seen combat service in the Civil War, were changed by the experience. And how did that influence Garfield as a person and as a politician?
Well, I mean, as you know, Garfield, of course, fought in the war. He volunteered very early on, about August of 1861. So the war was only a few months old when he volunteered. And, he went because he believed the war was about slavery from day one. He literally wrote a letter 2 days after the attack on Fort Sumter, where he says, "The war will soon assume the shape of slavery and freedom. The world will so understand it, and I believe the final outcome will redound to the good of humanity." So, and of course, growing up in Northeast Ohio, Garfield comes from an area sort of rife with abolition. He's a lifelong member of the Disciples of Christ who have very strong feelings against slavery. So, Garfield has a lot of reasons to be vocally anti-slavery. And he believes the war to be about slavery, and therefore he believes it to be something of a crusade, really, which eventually it did become, although notably it was, Lincoln himself resisted that language for the first year and a half or so. And even though I think deep down Lincoln knew from day one that there's no way this war could go on without getting rid of slavery. There's no way the two sides could come back together and leave slavery intact. But he wasn't ready to say that yet. And Garfield was critical of Lincoln for that, by the way. Of course, Garfield had the luxury of not being president quite yet at that point. So he could be critical of Lincoln. Lincoln was the one that had to govern. And I think history has borne Lincoln out pretty well on most things, including this. So anyway, Garfield feels it's his duty to fight. And so he joins the Union Army and, serves about, 2.5 years in uniform. During the war in the fall of 1862, Republicans here in Northeast Ohio in the old 19th congressional district nominate him to run for the House of Representatives. He's easily elected because, of course, again, this is a very Republican area at that point. And then he has this kind of internal conflict about should he stay in the Army or should he go to Congress? And he actually gets an audience with Lincoln and asks Lincoln this question. And Lincoln says, I've got more I'm paraphrasing obviously, but I've got more generals than I know what to do with. I don't have enough reliable Republican votes in Congress, and I need someone there who's been in the Army and knows what the Army needs. And Garfield, writes in a letter to his friend that he didn't feel it was appropriate to consult his own feelings on the matter. When the president asks you to do this, you do it. So Garfield leaves the Army at the tail end of 1863 and goes into Congress. And of course, that's where he stays until he's elected president. But the war had a great effect on him. I mean, it was really the defining moment. It was the defining event of his life, as it was for that entire generation that Oliver Wendell Holmes talked about in that great quote that you read and that I've heard many times before. Garfield was, as I said, vocally anti-slavery. So he believed the war to be an anti-slavery crusade, but he also was personally touched because men that he knew died. And he really writes some very emotional letters home to his wife and to some of his friends back in Ohio when men that he knows and men that he recruited are dying. Many of them from disease, some of them in battle. He takes that very personally, and it really affects him deeply. And so Garfield then, as he transitions from being a soldier to a politician, is not at all averse to waving that bloody shirt, as you mentioned a few minutes ago. And I think he does that with some legitimacy because he was there. He was on as were many later, elected officials were veterans. But, Garfield was there. He saw friends and men that he recruited and men whose parents he talked to and convinced them to let their son join the Army. He has seen these men die. And it was a deeply emotional experience for him. So the war is always in his mind. Not only remembering these men that he served with and that were close to him that died or were wounded and perhaps permanently disabled or disfigured, but also the African Americans who he really believed ultimately the war to be a crusade to free them from enslavement. And so that the war itself and then the politics of abolition and slavery are very much in his mind throughout his entire political career. And as I try to make the point in the book, by 1880, when he's running for president, a lot of Republicans have kind of moved on. They're not really talking as much about civil rights anymore. They feel like they've kind of done all they needed to do for African Americans. They of course, prosecuted the war and were able to free them from enslavement, but then they also passed the Reconstruction Amendments of the Constitution. So they've, abolished slavery. They've made them citizens. They've given them, or Black men at least, the franchise, allowing them to vote. They've done enough. And so a lot of Republicans start moving away from civil rights by the late 1870s, early 1880s. And James Garfield is one of those Republicans who's still very vocally saying that we have so much more work we need to do. We've come a long way, yes, but there's still so much more work to do. And in my view, at least, I think that's something that made him a very appealing candidate in 1880, especially when you consider, how this all shook out and how he ended up as really a compromise candidate. He wasn't anyone that most people were thinking about. Some were, a few here and there, but ultimately he's a compromise candidate. But I think because he sort of harkened back to really the true roots of the Republican Party, founded in the 1850s to oppose the expansion of slavery and to promote at least some some degree of equality for everyone, economic equality, racial equality. I think those are some of the things that really made him an appealing candidate to a lot of people in 1880.
I'm reminded when you mentioned that the conversation that he has with Lincoln about being able to make generals, about that famous comment about that Lincoln made after he'd been told that in the wake of some unfortunate events, like several generals and a large number of horses had been captured, and he said, "I very much regretted this because I can make generals, but I cannot make a horse."
That's right.
But so you alert the fact that he goes into the convention in Chicago not as anybody's real candidate. He's sort of the man of John Sherman, the brother of the renowned Civil War general William Tecumseh Sherman. And he comes out after 36 ballots or something like that as the nominee of the party. How does this happen?
Yeah, and this is unique in that I believe, I'm 99% sure I'm right about this. Garfield is the first presidential candidate ever nominated to actually be present at the convention that nominates him. In this era and far back in American history as well, candidates who were serious candidates for the presidency didn't go to nominating conventions. It was considered bad form. It was considered unseemly. It was thought they were too eager, too ambitious. They all wanted to portray this image of kind of accepting this as a duty and serving the country because that's what the country has asked them to do. Obviously, they all wanted to be president. I mean, let's not kid ourselves that anyone, didn't really want to be president. Of course, they all wanted to be president. And I think that's probably true today as well, except today it's normal for us to see candidates really be able to go out and say, I want to be president. I'm seeking this office. You should vote for me because of these policies that I will put in place or whatever. So Garfield's unique in that he's actually present when he's nominated, and that is one of the reasons I do believe that he really didn't expect this to happen. There's a lot of speculation out there that he was kind of working behind the scenes for his own benefit, and a lot of people who supported John Sherman thought that as well, that Garfield was serving his own interests more than he was serving Sherman's. Garfield knew people were talking about them, and he didn't really try to tamp that down. But ultimately, I think if he really thought there was any chance he would actually end up being nominated, I don't think he would have gone anywhere near that convention. I think he would have found a way to get out of it. The only reason he went is because John Sherman asked him to go. Garfield had been in the House of Representatives since the end of 1863. In January of 1880, 5 months before this convention, he had been elected to the U.S. Senate. And he had done that, of course, at this point, state legislatures elected senators, not citizens, not voters. So Garfield had managed to win that election to the Senate by the Ohio legislature with John Sherman's help. So Sherman then in turn said, okay, well, I supported you for the Senate. I'd like you to support my bid for the Republican presidential nomination. Sherman at this point is Secretary of the Treasury under President Hayes, and Garfield, feeling obligated, says, okay. Garfield knows John Sherman has very little chance to actually be the Republican nominee in 1880, but he's going to do what he said he was going to do. And so Sherman asks him to not only support his bid, but to go to Chicago, go to the convention, and place his name in nomination. Garfield does this. Again, not necessarily happy about it. He really didn't want to go to the convention, but he was obligated. And so he went and he gave this speech nominating Sherman, and the speech was fantastic. And so when the convention then deadlocked between Ulysses S. Grant, James Blaine, and John Sherman, none of them having enough votes to win the nomination, the party went looking for a compromise candidate, and suddenly Garfield's name is on many people's lips as a potential compromise candidate. The speech he gave for Sherman, I think, opened a lot of people's eyes to just how articulate he was, and everybody liked Garfield, even if they didn't agree with him. And there was a lot of factionalism in the party at this point, and Garfield was kind of able to straddle the fence a little bit between the factions and be somebody that most people could say, okay, he's not offensive to us. will accept him. So again, he is a true compromise nominee. He's not someone that was at all a serious candidate in before the convention started. And again, I believe that's the case because yes, he knew a few people had whispered about him here and there, but I don't believe he would have gone to that convention if he really had thought that anything like this could really happen. Now, as the convention goes on, it's becoming more and more clear to him that more and more people are talking about him. And he writes, letters home to his wife where he says, that the convention that seems to be turning some of its attention to me. So he's aware that this is happening, but I still don't think he really believed that it was going to happen.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, in a way, it's not entirely dissimilar to the way that Lincoln had been nominated, in the sense that Lincoln went to a convention with at least two other far better supported candidates, and then ends up as neither of us can get enough votes on repeated ballots, so let's find a third candidate who isn't one of the other two, and maybe we can get people to come together for him.
And Lincoln has this great line in 1860 where he basically says he's trying to be everyone's second choice so that they will be forced to look to him if they should have to give up their first love, as he puts it. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. William Henry Seward is who everyone thinks will be the nominee in 1860, but suddenly Republicans get very nervous about him because he has this very vocal and long record of speeches promoting abolitionism. And the Republicans at that point in 1860 are only 6 years old. So, they're just trying to stay above water, really, and remain relevant. And they feel like if we nominate this guy who's a radical on abolition, we're going to lose. And here comes all of a sudden the second choice of everyone, this guy from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, who doesn't really have much of a record because, he served in the Illinois legislature a few times and he served one term in Congress in the late 1840s, but he doesn't really have a record that people can oppose. So that's really how we end up with President Abraham Lincoln to some degree. Is, of course, Lincoln's a brilliant politician and he strategized and positioned himself very well. But ultimately, it was the fact that he didn't really have a record. Well, Garfield has a long record. I mean, he's been in Congress for 17 years at this point. But he is in something of a similar situation in that there are other people that everyone assumes one of them will be nominated. The most prominent, of course, in 1880 is U.S. Grant, who's already been president for 2 terms, and of course is famous as the general who defeated the Confederacy and won the Civil War. And so, everybody assumed, well, if Grant wants to be president again, then Grant will be president again. But there were a lot of people, including James Garfield, who were very, very nervous about this, not because, although Grant and Garfield weren't really necessarily all that close, the real main concern there was Garfield and others didn't really think it was appropriate for anyone to seek a third term. This had never been done before. The example of George Washington voluntarily giving up the presidency, giving up power after 2 terms, was practically religion. And now all of a sudden Grant is talking, as much as people loved Grant and revered him for what he had done during the Civil War, suddenly people were very uncomfortable with this idea that anyone would break this precedent set by the even more revered George Washington. So that's really why there was opposition to Grant in 1880. And I think the Grant forces at that 1880 convention, led by guys like Roscoe Conkling and John Logan, they really underestimated just how strong that anti-third term streak was. And of course, because this is when, this is the period in history when the conventions really did the heavy lift. I mean, they're the ones who actually had to pick the nominee and vote. It wasn't up to the voters like it is today with primaries and caucuses. They had to marshal forces and get votes and get delegates committed to Grant, and they weren't able to do it. And a lot of that is because of opposition to this idea of a third term. That's why the convention is thrown into chaos, and suddenly they need a compromise candidate.
Yeah, I mean, there's an element too with Grant of they don't want to serve up leftovers from a meal that a lot of people didn't like the first time, in the sense that although Grant was a fine person, there were some Grant adjacent people in his administration who were less good. and there were sort of there had been a lot of corruption associated with his administration, and I think there was this, I got the impression from reading many things, your book not the least among them, that there was a kind of worry that he would drag some of that with him, and that would be a drag on his candidacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, people still revered Grant. We know now, he was personally honest. I mean, he wasn't corrupt or on the take himself. He did surround himself with some people who very often served their own interests rather than his or the country's, and now, here now in 2020, historians have really reassessed Grant, and he's actually considered a pretty good president now, primarily because of what he did do for civil rights, and he did take on the Ku Klux Klan, and it's now, where at one time he was considered kind of at best inconsequential president. That's really not the case. He was actually very important. But I think you're right. In 1880, there was that sense that as you kind of said, we had this meal already, and we really don't want it again. And so I think between the worries about corruption, but then especially just the idea of kind of going against the precedent set by George Washington, all of these things kind of came together to make Grant's nomination impossible.
Yeah, Grant's reputation has really been improved, I think, by the publication of Ron Chernow's gigantic biography of him now 3 or 4 years ago, maybe. I really recommend this book to people listening. It's kind of a wrist cracker. You definitely it's a project, but it's a great book, and I learned a ton about Grant and about what he was really all about, and the things he actually accomplished, counter to his reputation.
Yeah, I read that, and I also enjoyed that very much, and I'm glad to see Grant getting a sort of a second look now, because I do think he's very, very important, and I think it's a shame that for years and years and years people thought, he kind of crested in the Civil War, and then as a president was kind of a disaster, and that's really not the case. But yes, he didn't always have the best people around him, and that continued even after his presidency, when he got his whole fortune wiped out and all this stuff. So yeah, and then of course the tragedy of how he died with the cancer, and trying to race against time to finish the memoir and everything. It's a powerful story.
Yeah, it's also, by the way, worth reading. His memoirs are a real literary achievement, and yet another thing that I think a lot of people don't know about Grant, if you read his memoirs kind of next to Sherman's, just to take a for instance, Sherman's are really interesting, but Grant's are really beautiful to read, really well crafted, and another thing that more people should read than have done.
Yeah, the only complaint I have about Grant's memoir is I wish he would have covered his presidency.
Sure, yeah.
But of course he stops at the end of the Civil War, and of course, literally dies, 4 or 5 days after finishing the writing. So even if he had wanted to write more, obviously he wouldn't have been able to do it. But I wish he would have been able to cover his presidency as well. I'd be very interested to read what he thought about his own presidency.
Sure, yeah, he definitely. I mean, so you talk less, and I think rightly so, given the focus of the book, about Winfield Scott Hancock, the Democratic nominee for president that time around, another Civil War general, in that somewhat second rank of Civil War figures below Grant and Sherman on the Union side, but definitely a guy with quite courageous service, especially if you read what happened at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was very instrumental in especially on the second day, and holding onto the Union position. But he is sort of one of those guys like McClellan, who's a sort of war Democrat. McClellan, you could argue how interested he was in the war, but that's a whole other in prosecuting the war. But he is sort of nominated, but he's also got another job. So and you mentioned, and this is really true, that you're not expected to go out there and campaign, but he's got a lot of other things on his plate over and above just being the Democratic nominee for president in 1880.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hancock is, as you say, is very heroic during the Civil War. He's a West Point graduate. He fought in the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, stayed in the Army his whole career, and then, of course, was instrumental in a number of Civil War battles, Gettysburg being one of those. But he's a lifelong Democrat. He was born in Pennsylvania, right outside Philadelphia, lifelong Democrat. And, he navigated Army politics very well. But national elective politics were a whole different ballgame. But a lot of people knew he was kind of, he had dreams of being president someday. He had gotten a few looks at some previous Democratic conventions. The real question for the Democrats in 1880 was, is Samuel Tilden going to run again? Because, of course, if Tilden wanted to run again in 1880, he would have been nominated on the first ballot. Because, of course, again, he had won the popular vote in 1876. He had been ahead in the Electoral College, and Democrats had, a pretty legitimate argument to say that the election was kind of stolen from him. He should have been president. And if he wanted to come back in 1880 and basically claim what was rightfully his, they would have supported him in that. And then Tilden kind of hems and haws a little bit. And his health really wasn't great by 1880, so it's probably good that he didn't run. But he kind of went back and forth about whether or not he was running. And, he would tell one person one thing and the other person something else. And then eventually just kind of said he would accept the nomination, but only if it was unanimous. And of course, that wasn't going to happen, even in an 1880 convention with a candidate like Tilden, who many people thought had been robbed in 1876. He wasn't going to be. So they basically kind of dropped Tilden very early on in that Democratic convention in 1880. And who are they going to run in 1880? And there were a number of other candidates. But I think the thing that really appealed to the Democrats about Hancock was you can't wave the bloody shirt at a guy like Winfield Scott Hancock. You mentioned this earlier, John, and this idea of waving the bloody shirt is basically, it's basically the Republican fallback for 2 or 3 decades after the Civil War, where Republicans can very easily remind voters that, hey, Democrats are the party of secession, the party of slavery, the party of white supremacy, the party that, tried to destroy the Union. Jefferson Davis was a Democrat and Alexander Stephens was a Democrat. You don't want to give these guys the government. Rutherford B Hayes called it, give the government to the rebels. You don't want to do that. They sent 300,000 Northern men to their graves in this war. You can't really make that argument against Winfield Scott Hancock, because guess what? He fought for the North too. The 1880 is the only election in American history, the only one where both candidates are Union veterans. So again, hey, James Garfield has a great war record, but it is nothing compared to Winfield Scott Hancock, who is a career soldier and is still, as you mentioned, on active duty. Is still a general on active duty. He's commander of the Department of the Atlantic. So yes, he has a regular job he has to do every single day, and he's also now nominated to run for president. Very different time, obviously, where we have active duty generals running for president while they're still on active duty. That obviously could not happen today. Interestingly enough, the man for whom Winfield Scott Hancock was named, General Winfield Scott, also ran for president in 1852 as a Whig and lost to Franklin Pierce. So I don't know what it is about that name, but it presidential politics are in the blood, I guess. But at any rate, Hancock becomes a very appealing candidate for the Democrats, because they know that Republicans can't wave the bloody shirt at him. He's also palatable to white Southern Democrats because he had served very briefly in the South after the war as the commander of the, I believe it was the 5th Military District, which was headquartered in New Orleans. Right, yeah. And he had issued this order that basically said, the war is over. There's no more rebellion. The Army really has no business being here protecting Black people. And we should immediately turn over as much of civic responsibility as possible back to Southern white men. And that was music to the ears of white Southern Democrats. It was music to their ears in 1867 when he issued that order. It was music to their ears 13 years later in 1880. So he was palatable to the South, even though he had fought for the Union. He was somebody that white Southern Democrats were happy to accept because they suspected that, he kind of was of the same mind that they were at that point in history. So Hancock is really fascinating. And yes, I spend far less time on him in this book than I do on Garfield, because ultimately Garfield's kind of the main character in this particular chapter in history. But Hancock was a fairly strong candidate. He didn't really have to say much or do much, but just because of who he was a fairly strong candidate. And hey, as I said at the beginning, Garfield only won this election by 10,000 or less or fewer popular votes. So I think that speaks more to really just how divided the country was at the time. But this 1880 election, this was the first instance of the so-called Solid South, where the entire South went straight Democratic. There were no more carpetbagging Republicans down there to turn the tide in places like South Carolina or Louisiana. The South went solid Republican or solid Democrat, for Hancock. And Garfield still managed to win the majority in the Electoral College, a substantial majority. But this is really a sort of a very interesting election and a very important election, because again, you've got two Union veterans, but also this is where you really start to see that Solid South emerge. We talk now more modern about the Solid South as being solid Republican, because of course the parties have changed and shifted over the years. But even that's really not the case anymore when you see Georgia and Virginia and places like that now voting for Democrats sometimes. So but at any rate, this is kind of how Hancock ended up as the candidate in 1880 for the Democrats.
Yeah, that's somebody told, I'm trying to remember which of the sort of Republican grandees told Garfield that the best thing he could do was say nothing and look wise.
Yeah, that was Hayes. That was President Hayes. Yeah.
And it wasn't bad advice.
No, it was very good advice. And in fact, it was what was expected at this point in American history. Presidential Garfield had already broke the mold somewhat in that he was at the convention that nominated him, but he was expected to conform to what was normal campaign posture at that time, which was, you're the candidate, you don't say anything, you don't do anything, you stay home, you don't talk to anybody, you don't write. Somebody told him, give no speeches and write no letters about politics. And then Hayes, of course, advises him famously to sit cross-legged and look wise, but don't say anything. The wild card here, of course, is people start showing up in Mentor, Ohio, where you and I work and live, in Mentor, Ohio, coming to Garfield's home, really just trying to see him and get a glimpse of him and see if he had anything to say. And eventually, this is where Garfield kind of decides he can't really just ignore these people that are hanging around his home and his farm. And so he starts talking to them from the front porch of the house. And then this is where we get the nation's first ever front porch presidential campaign. So Garfield really doesn't follow the advice of Rutherford B Hayes and people like that. He does give speeches, but the speeches are not what we expect from candidates today. They're not policy speeches. He really is talking about some of these bloody shirt ideas that we've been going back and forth about. Just reminding people of the record of the Republican Party, and the party is the party of Lincoln. Of course, by the time 1880 rolls around, Garfield, like everybody else, reveres Lincoln as kind of the patron saint of the Republican Party, and even though he had disagreed with Lincoln on some things when Lincoln was still alive. So Garfield does kind of break the mold a little bit of presidential campaigning, and that he does campaign for himself. Again, he's not saying, vote for me and I will do this, this, and this in the first 100 days or whatever. He's not talking about himself. He's talking about the party. But still, it is a step toward the more modern style of presidential campaigns. So for those of you that are listening, if you're a political junkie and you love politics and you love, political news, you can thank James Garfield. He kind of set us somewhat on that path to the more modern style of campaigning. If you hate politics and you get tired of, 2 years worth of commercials for people running for office, well, you can blame somewhat James Garfield for that too. It just depends on which side of the fence you're on, I guess.
All right. Well, there's just an absolute ton in this book, and I wish we had much more time. I have 2 more questions for you, and they are these.
Okay.
One, what was the Greenback Party, and why should people care about them?
Yeah, the Greenback Party was the most consequential of the third and fourth and fifth and sixth parties, I guess you would say, in 1880. The Greenback Party's main issue was finance policy. Greenbacks were the nicknames given to paper money during the Civil War. You know, and if you, of course, I don't have my wallet on me, and even if I did, it doesn't have any money in it. But um, if you pull a 5 or a 10 or a single out of your wallet right now, it's green because they use that green ink. Well, this started during the Civil War when the government started using paper money, and Greenback Party members really liked this paper money because it was inflationary in nature, and it had a higher value, and therefore it helped farmers and people, and workers. It was more valuable to them. It helped them pay off their debts. Others, the majority of elected officials at this point, including James Garfield, liked hard money that was backed by gold, and they thought that was had more value, and it also had something behind it other than just the good name of the United States government, which is really what's behind the Greenbacks. So the Greenback Party was formed in the 1870s. They did run candidates for office. They did get a few people elected to Congress here and there. In 1880, they ran a guy by the name of James B. Weaver for president. Weaver was also a Civil War veteran for the Union. He was from Iowa, and actually was a former Republican, and had just kind of gotten disaffected with the Republicans because of fiscal policy, and because so many Republicans like Garfield were still bound and determined to keep the U.S. on the gold standard, and to advocate for hard money rather than this paper money, which had less value when hard money was still primarily in circulation. So the Greenback Party was the most significant third party in the 1880 election. Weaver got, I don't even remember how many. I mean, it's in the book, but I don't even remember how many votes he got. Maybe a couple 100,000, something like that. Not enough to, I guess you could say, had those votes not gone to Weaver, they would more likely have gone to Garfield, because Weaver himself was a former Republican. But it still would have been a close popular vote, even if Garfield had gotten those Weaver votes. There also was the Prohibition Party, which was all about prohibition of alcohol. They ran a candidate in 1880. There were a few other sort of smaller regional parties that ran candidates too. But yeah, the Greenback Party was the most significant third party in 1880. But again, Weaver didn't get enough votes to really affect the outcome.
Yeah, the hard money, soft money thing has a sort of long provenance in American history. So that, I remember doing research for a talk I did last year, or the year before, on Hamilton. And Hamilton, one of the big reasons that he wanted to centralize, why he founded the mint, and why he wanted to centralize the putting out of money, was because there were all these, that individual states kept putting out, money.
They were putting out their own money.
Gold.
Yeah.
And all this, farmers really loved it, because farmers are always in debt. For those of you who aren't immediately grasping this, inflation is good if you're in debt, because the value of your debt goes down. It stays at $600. There just happen to be more dollars running around. So because farmers are always in debt, and to this day, inflation works a little bit better for them, because it means that their fixed debts decrease in value. So there was in the rural parts of the country, I think, some support enduring for this, why some people thought well, we'll start a political party that can get some traction on that issue.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of those Greenbackers eventually kind of maybe migrated over to the Populist Party when that got really big in the 1890s or so, I think. So, and the Populists had a lot of those same ideas about fiscal policy and policies that were more geared towards farmers and people like that. So. But yeah, you're right. It's a very long story, and I've probably said all I can say about it without starting to to sound like I don't know anything, because I'm not an economic historian by any means, and that is a very sort of spiral you can go down and have a hard time climbing out of.
Sure. This is the thing we really, when the more you read about, the more one reads about Alexander Hamilton, He was one of those people who actually really understood it, which you got to respect, because I sure don't.
Yeah.
But okay, so have time for one more question. My question is this: why is James Garfield the last Lincoln Republican?
Yes, that was a that was an interesting choice for the title, and one of my coworkers said, "Oh, you just put that in there because if you put Lincoln in there, it'll sell because people love Lincoln." And I hadn't actually thought of that until she said that, and then I thought, "Oh, well, I guess we'll see," but I doubt that's the case. But my view, and I think I alluded to this earlier, John, is just simply that Garfield is kind of in my view the last of kind of that original generation of Republicans and what I call Lincoln Republicans, because obviously Lincoln is the first Republican president. He's on board with the Republican Party, not immediately, but pretty soon after the party is formed in the 1850s. And as I said earlier, the Republicans are formed in 1854 in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And there's this misconception that all Republicans were always abolitionists, and that's certainly not the case. Lincoln was no abolitionist at that point, but they did believe in some degree of equality for everyone, equality, economic equality, racial equality. They certainly didn't all, Lincoln included, feel that the black man was the social or the intellectual equal of the white man, but that also didn't mean he should be enslaved either. And so I just view Garfield, because he was the last Republican, or one of the last Republicans that was still very vocally talking about civil rights in 1880 and in 1881 as president, because he does dedicate quite a bit of his inaugural address to talking about civil rights. That's kind of my idea of him as the last Lincoln Republican, the last Republican to become president, who came from that first generation and still really represented those original ideals of the party. I know, we get it. Benjamin Harrison is president he wins election in 1888. He and Garfield are pretty close to the same age. So Harrison and Garfield are of the same, generation, but I don't, Harrison was, was somewhat good on civil rights, but also really bad on American Indian policy and some of these other things. And, really was involved in this kind of, I think, what was really basically just kind of a power grab by the Republicans. They added like 6 states to the Union during Harrison's 4 years in office, really just trying to get as many Republicans as possible into Congress, and trying to avoid, the Democrats getting back into power, especially after 4 years of Grover Cleveland. Then, of course, it didn't work because Cleveland came back in 1892 and beat Harrison. But so that's kind of what I mean by the last Lincoln Republican. Just Garfield is the last president who really embodies that original vision of what the Republican Party was supposed to be. And that was changing even by 1880 as more Republicans moved away from civil rights and they started going to, financiers and industrialists and finding alliances there. And this is when the Republican Party kind of starts to take on that reputation, whether deserved or not, as the party of big business. But Garfield was not quite. Of course, he wasn't around for a lot of that because he was assassinated. But in my view, he just is the last Republican to be president who really embodied that original vision of what the Republican Party was supposed to be.
All right. Well, we probably should leave it there. Thank you so much to Todd for coming out and having this conversation. It was really fascinating, as usual. Thanks also to everybody who tuned in. Please do peruse our calendar. It's up on our website, or go and get our cover to cover. We'll send it to you by email every month, and it'll let you know all the sort of interesting things that are going on at the library, especially because of COVID time. We're trying to do a lot more online stuff to try and give people a little distraction. So if you like this talk, please do know, and we try to be responsive to all the things that people want for the community. We're here to serve the community. Once again, thanks so much, Todd. There's just an absolutely fascinating conversation. I urge you all to read the book. There's so much more in it than we had the chance to. I could do another hour of interview, but I don't think any of us want that. So
maybe not tonight, but
right,
right. Well, hey, John, let me just say too that of course, you can get the book obviously anywhere you buy books, whether that's Amazon, Barnes and Noble, whatever. It looks like it just hit on Kindle. So if you're interested in Kindle and Nook through Barnes and Noble, and then apparently, and again, nobody obviously tells me anything because I have to go on Amazon like anybody else and look for these things. But apparently it's available on audiobook now too. So they didn't ask me to read it. I don't even know who read it, but somebody did apparently. So that's good.
Well, I'm sure it's too bad that people will miss out on hearing your honeyed tones delivering
yes.
delivering the text. But yeah, everyone, once again, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.